The alarm at Blackstone Power Station screamed through the night air like something alive. Red lights spun across the control room walls, throwing sharp shadows over every panicked face. On the main screen, a single word blinked over and over: failure. The massive turbine engine, the heart of the entire plant, had just shut down without warning. $5 million of steel, wiring, and precision parts had gone silent in less than 4 seconds. Somewhere in the city beyond the plant's fences, hospitals, homes, and schools depended on the power this engine produced. Now that power was gone, Gordon Price, the plant manager, stood frozen in front of the monitors, his phone already buzzing with calls from head office. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, though the room was cold. He had built his entire career on keeping this plant running without a single major failure. Tonight, that record had just been erased. "Get every technician in here," Gordon shouted, his voice cracking. "Now." Workers rushed in from every direction, boots pounding against the metal floor grates. Radios crackled with confused voices asking the same question. What happened? Nobody had an answer yet. In the middle of the chaos, one man moved differently from the rest. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't panicking. Ryan Cole walked straight toward the turbine bay with a flashlight in one hand and a tool bag in the other, his eyes already scanning every gauge he passed. Ryan had worked the night shift at Blackstone for almost 6 years. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have a framed degree hanging on his wall. What he had was something harder to put into words, a kind of instinct built from thousands of hours spent with his hands inside broken machines that other people had already given up on. He knelt beside the turbine housing and pressed his palm against the metal casing. Still warm, but the wrong kind of warm, uneven. Something inside had overheated in a place it shouldn't have. "Cole, get away from there," Gordon barked from across the room. "Corporate is sending their own people. We don't touch anything until they arrive." Ryan stood up slowly, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that in a place like this, keeping quiet was often safer than speaking the truth. He stepped back and watched the chaos unfold around him. He thought about his daughter, sleeping at home right now, unaware that her father might be walking into the biggest disaster of his career. Ellie was only 8 years old, and she needed her medicine every single week. That medicine was not cheap, and Ryan's job was the only thing standing between her and going without it. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier in a car accident on a rainy October night. Since then, it had just been Ryan and Ellie, learning to survive together, day by day, paycheck by paycheck. He had taken this job because it was steady. Now, steady felt like a word from another lifetime. By 6 in the morning, the sun had barely risen when 3 black SUVs pulled into the plant's parking lot. Doors opened in unison, and a team of engineers stepped out, dressed in crisp shirts with the manufacturer's logo stitched over their hearts. At the front of the group walked a tall man with silver hair and sharp eyes, carrying a leather case like it held the answers to everything. His name was Alan Whitfield, and he was known across the industry as one of the best turbine specialists in the country. If anyone could fix this engine, people said, it would be him. Gordon practically ran to greet him at the door. "Dr. Whitfield, thank you for coming so quickly. We are losing power capacity by the hour. The city needs this fixed." Whitfield nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Show me the engine." The engineers spent the next several hours running tests, connecting laptops to control panels, and speaking to each other in technical language that most of the plant staff couldn't follow. Ryan stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, listening carefully to every word. He noticed something odd. The engineers kept focusing on the same 3 systems, checking them over and over, while a small section near the cooling intake barely got a second glance. Ryan had walked past that section 100 times during routine checks. Something about it had felt slightly off for weeks, though he had never been able to explain why. He wanted to speak up. He wanted to mention it. But every time he opened his mouth, someone with more letters after their name spoke first, and his words disappeared into the noise of the room. By late afternoon, Whitfield gathered everyone into the main conference room. Gordon sat at the head of the table, his hands folded tightly in front of him, like a man praying for good news he already suspected would never come. "The internal components have suffered catastrophic thermal damage," Whitfield said, his voice calm and final. The core assembly is beyond repair. I'm sorry to say this, but rebuilding this unit would cost more than replacing it entirely. My recommendation is a full engine replacement. Gordon's face went pale. That's another $5 million. We don't have that kind of money sitting around, Doctor. This plant is already operating on thin margins. I understand the difficulty, Whitfield replied, but attempting a repair carries serious risk. If it fails again, you could lose far more than money. You could lose lives. The room fell into heavy silence. Somewhere down the hallway, a phone rang and rang, unanswered. Ryan stood near the doorway, listening to grown men with impressive titles agree that a $5 million engine, one that had worked perfectly just days ago, was now nothing more than expensive scrap metal. He thought about the cooling intake again. He thought about the strange whining sound the engine had made only 2 nights earlier, a sound he had reported to his supervisor but that nobody had followed up on. He thought about all the small details that never made it into official reports, because nobody stopped long enough to listen to the people who worked closest to the machines every single day. That night, Ryan drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. When he walked through his front door, Ellie was already asleep on the couch, her homework still spread across the coffee table, one shoe missing, the television glowing quietly in the background. He gently lifted her into his arms and carried her to bed, brushing her hair back from her forehead the way he always did. She stirred but didn't wake. "I've got you," he whispered. "I always will." He returned to the living room and sat down at the small kitchen table, pulling out a worn folder of maintenance logs he had kept over the years, his own personal notes that no one else at the plant had ever bothered to read, page after page of small observations, unusual readings, sounds that didn't quite match the manuals. Somewhere in these pages, Ryan believed, was the truth about what had really gone wrong. And if he was right, it wasn't the kind of failure that needed a $5 million replacement. It was the kind of failure that needed someone patient enough and stubborn enough to actually look. Outside his window, the night stretched on, quiet and cold. Inside, under a single lamp, a tired father who had never once called himself an expert began searching for an answer that a room full of experts had already decided didn't exist. He had no idea yet how much was riding on what he would find. He only knew he couldn't stop looking, not with his daughter asleep down the hall, not with 200 families depending on jobs that could vanish within days, not when something inside him kept whispering that the real problem was still hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally notice. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Ryan turned another page in his folder, and for the first time all day, his eyes narrowed with the beginning of understanding. The next morning, the plant felt different. Workers moved through the hallways with their heads down, speaking in low voices, as if the building itself already knew what was coming. Word had spread fast. Corporate had approved the recommendation. A brand new turbine engine would be ordered, and the current one would be stripped for parts. The decision had been made in a room none of the regular staff had been invited into. Along with the announcement came something even worse. A memo, printed on plain paper and pinned to the breakroom board, listed the departments that would face reductions if the plant could not secure emergency funding to cover the replacement cost. Maintenance was near the top of that list. Ryan read the memo twice, his stomach tightening with every word. He wasn't just fighting to save an engine anymore. He was fighting to keep the only steady income that stood between his daughter and going without the things she needed most. He found Sam Bennett near the supply room, leaning against a stack of crates, scrolling through his phone with a tired expression. Sam had been Ryan's closest friend at the plant since the day Ryan started, back when neither of them had any idea how complicated this job would eventually become. "You see the memo?" Sam asked without looking up. "Yeah," Ryan said. "Hard to miss it." Sam finally glanced at him, studying his face for a long moment. "You've got that look again, the one you get when you think you know something nobody else does." Ryan hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was a page from his notes, filled with small handwritten details about the cooling intake, temperatures, timestamps, and a strange pattern he had noticed building for weeks before the failure. "I don't think the core is actually destroyed," Ryan said quietly. "I think something upstream caused it to overheat. If that's true, Replacing the whole engine is like throwing away a car because the engine light didn't work properly. You'd be fixing the wrong problem. Sam let out a low whistle. You really believe that? I do. But nobody's going to listen to me. Whitfield already gave his answer, and Gordon signed off on it before the ink was even dry. Then don't tell them, Sam said. Show them. Ryan almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Show them how. I'm not authorized to touch that engine. If I go near it without approval and something goes wrong, I could lose my job before I even get the chance to prove I was right. And if you don't try, Sam replied, you'll definitely lose your job in a few months, when they cut half of maintenance to pay for a new engine you didn't need. The words settled heavily in Ryan's chest, because he knew Sam was right. There was no version of standing still that protected him. Either way, the ground beneath him was already shifting. That afternoon, a meeting was called for all senior staff and technical leads. Ryan wasn't supposed to attend, but Frank Doyle, his shift supervisor, waved him in at the last moment, muttering something about needing an extra set of hands to take notes. Ryan suspected Frank simply wanted him there for reasons he hadn't said out loud yet. The conference room was packed. Whitfield stood near the front, once again explaining the technical reasoning behind his recommendation, using diagrams projected onto the wall. Gordon sat beside him, nodding along with every point, eager to appear as though he had full command of a situation that was clearly spiraling beyond his control. When Whitfield opened the floor for questions, Ryan felt his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He raised his hand before he could talk himself out of it. I have a question about the cooling intake readings, Ryan said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. In the 2 weeks before the failure, I logged 3 separate incidents where the intake temperature spiked slightly above normal range, then dropped back down within minutes. Could that kind of pattern point to a blockage or a sensor issue, rather than a core failure? The room went quiet. Whitfield studied him for a moment, his expression polite, but unmistakably dismissive. And you are? Ryan Cole, maintenance technician. I see. Whitfield offered a thin smile, the kind adults give children who ask questions slightly beyond their understanding. Minor temperature fluctuations are common and rarely significant on their own. The damage we found inside the core assembly is consistent with a much larger structural failure, not a simple sensor glitch. I appreciate your attention to detail, but this situation requires a broader diagnostic approach than individual observations. A few quiet laughs rippled through the room. Gordon didn't laugh, but he didn't defend Ryan either. He simply looked down at his folder, clearly relieved that the awkward moment hadn't landed on him. Ryan felt heat rise up his neck, embarrassment mixing with frustration. He sat back in his chair and said nothing more for the rest of the meeting, though his mind kept circling back to the same unanswered question. If the fluctuations weren't important, why had they only started appearing in the weeks leading up to the exact section that failed? After the meeting ended, Frank caught up to him in the hallway. He was an older man, close to retirement, with decades of plant experience and a reputation for being blunt but fair. You didn't have to say anything in there, Frank said. I know, Ryan replied. But you're not wrong to wonder about it either. Frank glanced around before lowering his voice. I've been doing this a long time, Cole. I've seen engineers with fancy titles miss things a good technician would catch in 5 minutes, simply because they trust their instruments more than their eyes. Doesn't mean you're right, but it doesn't mean you're wrong either. That small bit of encouragement stayed with Ryan for the rest of the day, quietly fueling something he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet. He was going to look into this further, whether anyone approved of it or not. That evening, after picking Ellie up from her after-school program, Ryan made dinner while she sat at the kitchen table finishing a drawing for art class. She held it up proudly, a picture of a house with a bright yellow sun overhead and 2 stick figures holding hands in front of it. That's us, she said. I made the sun really big because you said the plant makes electricity like the sun makes light. Ryan smiled, though something tightened behind his ribs. It's a great drawing, sweetheart. Are you going to fix the big machine? She asked. You said it broke. He paused, surprised she remembered him mentioning it at all. I'm going to try, he said carefully. It might take some time. You always fix things, she said simply, as if it were an obvious fact of the universe, no different than the sun rising each morning. Later that night, once Ellie was asleep, Ryan sat down again with his notes, this time adding new details from the meeting, cross-referencing timestamps with weather reports, maintenance schedules, and past repair records going back nearly a year. He worked well past midnight, fueled by nothing but coffee, and a growing sense that he was close to understanding something important. Around 2 in the morning, he found it. A supplier change, buried deep in a records update, showed that a replacement part had been installed in the cooling intake system exactly 6 weeks before the first strange temperature reading appeared. The part had come from a different manufacturer than usual, due to a shortage from the original supplier. Ryan sat back in his chair, his pulse quickening. A different part meant different tolerances, different materials, possibly a design that didn't perfectly match the specifications the engine had been built around. If that part had a minor manufacturing flaw, it could slowly restrict flow through the cooling system without triggering any major alarms, gradually causing heat to build in exactly the area where the failure occurred. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a thread, and Ryan intended to pull it. The next few days passed in a blur of double shifts and stolen moments. Officially, Ryan clocked in for his usual maintenance duties. Unofficially, every spare minute became an opportunity to gather more information. He photographed old repair records with his phone. He quietly asked the parts department about the supplier change, framing his questions as routine curiosity, rather than an investigation. He even reached out to a former coworker who now worked directly for the parts supplier, asking careful questions about any known issues with that particular batch. Meanwhile, the countdown toward disaster continued ticking forward. Corporate scheduled a formal signing for the new engine purchase, set for the following week. Once that contract was signed, there would be no turning back. The old engine would be dismantled for scrap, taking with it any chance of proving what had really happened. Sam found Ryan late one night in the break room, hunched over his phone, comparing photographs of old maintenance logs. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Sam said. "I haven't, not really. You think you found something?" Ryan turned his phone toward him, showing the supplier records. A different intake part was installed 6 weeks before the failure. Nobody flagged it because it technically met the basic specifications, but basic isn't the same as identical. Sam studied the screen for a long moment. "If you're right, this isn't just about saving the engine. This is going to make Whitfield and his whole team look like they missed the obvious." "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone," Ryan said. "I just don't want 200 people to lose their jobs over a $5 million mistake that maybe, just maybe, didn't have to happen." Sam was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you'd better be sure. Because if you're wrong, and you go around this whole process, they won't just dismiss you next time. They'll fire you." Ryan already knew that. He had thought about little else for days. But every time he considered walking away, letting the experts handle it, letting the plant follow its official process, he thought about Ellie's medicine, about Frank's quiet encouragement, about the strange pattern hidden in the data that nobody else had bothered to notice. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when he was this close. That night, Ryan made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find a way into that engine himself, contract signing or not, permission or not, and he was going to prove what his instincts and his notes were both telling him was true. The only question left was whether he would find the answer in time, before the signature on a $5 million contract erased his only chance to prove it. The plant grew quiet after 11 at night, when the day shift emptied out, and only a handful of security staff and overnight monitors remained. Ryan had worked enough night shifts over the years to know every quiet corner, every hallway where the motion sensor lights took a few extra seconds to switch on, and every door that stayed unlocked simply because nobody thought it needed to be secured. He waited until his official shift ended, then lingered near the locker room instead of heading home, watching the clock tick toward midnight. His plan was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. He would examine the cooling intake system himself, gather physical evidence to support what the records had already suggested, and document everything carefully enough that no one could dismiss it as guesswork. He knew the risk. If anyone caught him near restricted equipment without authorization, he could be suspended immediately, possibly fired outright, especially with a formal liability concern hanging over the damaged engine. But the alternative felt worse. In a matter of days, this engine would be gone, dismantled and shipped off for scrap, taking every scrap of evidence with it. At 11:30, Ryan grabbed his tool bag and a flashlight and made his way toward the turbine bay. The building felt different at night, filled with a low hum of standby systems and the occasional distant clang of metal settling as it cooled. His footsteps echoed against the concrete floor, each one sounding far louder than he wanted it to be. He reached the access panel near the cooling intake and knelt down, running his flashlight beam along the housing. The section had been sealed off with warning tape after the failure, a clear sign that no one was supposed to touch it until the replacement contract went through. Ryan hesitated only a moment before carefully lifting the tape aside, promising himself he would put it back exactly as he found it. He opened the access panel and shined his light inside. Almost immediately, he noticed something the initial inspection reports hadn't mentioned. A thin residue coated the inner surface of the intake pathway, slightly darker than it should have been, with an unusual texture that didn't match ordinary carbon buildup. He carefully collected a sample using a clean cloth, sealing it inside a small plastic bag he had brought for exactly this purpose. His hands were steady, though his heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his ears. A sudden sound echoed from the hallway behind him. Footsteps. Ryan froze, quickly clicking off his flashlight and pressing himself against the shadow of the housing unit. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, before stopping just outside the turbine bay entrance. Cole? Ryan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was Frank's voice. He stepped out from behind the housing, raising his hands slightly as if surrendering, though there was no real threat in Frank's tired expression. "Frank, I can explain." Frank studied him for a long moment, glancing at the lifted warning tape, the open access panel, and the flashlight still gripped tightly in Ryan's hand. "I'm sure you can. Question is whether I want to hear it before or after I decide whether to report this." "Please," Ryan said quietly. "Just give me a chance to show you something." Frank crossed his arms, clearly wrestling with something internally. Then, to Ryan's relief, he stepped closer instead of turning to leave. "You've got 2 minutes. Make them count." Ryan quickly explained everything he had discovered, the supplier change, the timing of the temperature fluctuations, and now this unusual residue inside the intake pathway. He held up the sealed sample bag as proof that he wasn't simply speculating. Frank took the bag, turning it over slowly in the dim light, studying the residue with narrowed eyes. "This looks like it could be a coating breakdown. If that part was manufactured with a slightly different alloy, and it started degrading under heat stress, it could absolutely restrict airflow gradually, without tripping any major alarms until it finally choked the system entirely." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Ryan said. "If I'm right, replacing the entire core assembly means throwing away a perfectly good $5 million engine because of one faulty replacement part that cost maybe a few $100s. Frank exhaled slowly, running a hand across his weathered face. "You know what happens if you're wrong about this. And you know what happens to your job if you're caught doing unauthorized work on a unit that's already flagged for liability concerns." "I know," Ryan said. "But I also know what happens to 200 families if this plant goes forward, assuming a mistake that never gets corrected. Someone needs to at least ask the question properly." Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring at the sealed sample bag as though weighing years of caution against the small, stubborn certainty in front of him. Finally, he handed the bag back to Ryan. "I'm not going to report this," he said. "But I'm also not going to lie for you if someone asks directly. If you're doing this, you need proof strong enough to stand on its own, not just a theory and a sample of residue. Get real evidence, real testing, something Whitfield can't wave away with a fancy explanation." "How do I get real testing done in time? The signing is in 4 days." Frank thought for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if arriving at a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "There's an independent materials lab about 40 minutes from here. I know the technician who runs the night testing station. She owes me a favor from a long time ago. I can call her, see if she can rush an analysis on that sample. But you didn't hear that from me." Relief washed over Ryan, mixed with a fresh wave of nervous energy. "Thank you, Frank. I mean it." "Don't thank me yet," Frank said, already turning to leave. "Thank me if this actually works." The following morning, After a short and restless sleep, Ryan drove to the independent lab during his lunch break, carrying the sealed sample carefully in his jacket pocket, like something fragile and priceless. The technician, a sharp-eyed woman named Lauren Hicks, examined the sample under a microscope, while Ryan waited nervously in a small side room, watching through a narrow window. After nearly 20 minutes, Lauren stepped out, holding a printed report in her hand. "Your friend Frank said this was urgent, so I skipped ahead of a few other samples. You're going to want to see this." She handed him the report, pointing to a section highlighted in yellow. The residue contained trace elements consistent with a specific alloy coating breakdown, a known issue that occurred when certain metals were exposed to extended thermal cycling beyond their rated tolerance. "This kind of coating failure builds up slowly," Lauren explained. "It restricts airflow gradually, causing localized heat buildup exactly where you'd expect based on your description. It's subtle enough that a standard diagnostic checklist would likely miss it, especially if the inspection team assumed the part met full specifications, simply because it passed basic certification." Ryan felt a wave of vindication wash over him, quickly followed by a fresh surge of urgency. "Can you put this in writing? Something official I can bring back to my plant?" "Already did," Lauren said, tapping the report. "Full documentation, timestamps, everything. Whatever you're planning to do with this, I hope it works out." Ryan thanked her repeatedly, practically jogging back to his car with the report clutched tightly in his hand. For the first time since the failure, he felt something close to hope. But hope alone wouldn't be enough. He still needed to convince people with far more authority than him that a $5 million decision needed to be paused, based on the word of a maintenance technician and an independent lab report they had never commissioned themselves. Back at the plant that afternoon, Ryan approached Gordon's office, report in hand, feeling more nervous than he had in years. Gordon looked up from his desk, clearly surprised to see him standing there. "Cole, I'm in the middle of preparing for the signing tomorrow morning. What is it?" "I need 5 minutes," Ryan said. "I found something you need to see before that signing happens." Gordon's expression shifted from mild annoyance to genuine concern as Ryan laid out everything: the supplier records, the temperature fluctuations, the unauthorized sample, and finally the independent lab report confirming a coating breakdown consistent with everything he had suspected. When Ryan finished, Gordon sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples slowly. "You collected this sample without authorization, from a section that was sealed for liability reasons. I know that was against protocol," Ryan admitted. "But if I'm right, this proves the core assembly might not be the actual problem. This proves it could be repaired instead of replaced entirely." Gordon studied the report for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Whitfield's team already completed their assessment. Corporate is expecting to sign tomorrow morning. If I delay this based on an unauthorized test from an outside lab, and it turns out you're wrong, I'll be the one explaining that mistake to people far above my pay grade. And if I'm right," Ryan said quietly, "you'll be explaining why the plant spent $5 million replacing an engine that could have been repaired for a fraction of the cost." The office fell silent, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the air between them. Gordon stared at the report for what felt like an eternity, his fingers drumming slowly against his desk. Finally, he looked up, his expression tight with reluctant consideration. "I'll give you one chance. One, if Whitfield agrees to review this evidence tonight, and if he still believes there's reason to pause the signing, I'll delay it by 24 hours. But if he dismisses it again, the signing happens as scheduled tomorrow morning, and this conversation never happened. Understood?" Ryan nodded quickly, relief and terror mixing together in equal measure. "Understood. Thank you, Gordon." "Don't thank me," Gordon said, echoing Frank's words from the night before. "Just be right." That evening, Ryan waited outside the conference room while Gordon and Whitfield reviewed the lab report privately. Every minute felt like an hour. He paced the hallway, replaying every detail in his mind, searching for holes in his own reasoning, terrified he had missed something obvious that would collapse under Whitfield's scrutiny. When the door finally opened, Whitfield stepped out first, his expression harder to read than before, no longer dismissive, but not yet convinced either. "This is interesting," Whitfield said carefully. "It doesn't prove the core assembly is fully salvageable. But it does raise a legitimate question about whether we've correctly identified the root cause of the failure. Ryan's chest tightened with cautious hope. What does that mean? Whitfield glanced at Gordon, then back at Ryan. It means you've bought yourself a very narrow window. 24 hours to demonstrate that this theory holds up under direct testing on the actual unit, supervised, documented, and entirely at your own professional risk. If you're wrong, the signing proceeds immediately afterward, and there will be consequences for the unauthorized sample collection. And if I'm right? Ryan asked. Whitfield's expression remained cautious, but something behind his eyes had shifted, just slightly. Then we'll have an entirely different conversation tomorrow. Ryan barely slept that night, his mind racing through every step of the plan he would need to execute in the coming hours. 24 hours to prove what dozens of experts had already dismissed as impossible. 24 hours to save an engine, a plant, and everything his daughter depended on. The clock had started ticking, and there was no turning back now. By 7 in the morning, the turbine bay looked nothing like it had during Ryan's quiet, secretive visit 2 nights earlier. Bright work lights had been set up around the engine housing, and a small crowd had already gathered, drawn by whispers that had spread through the plant overnight. Whitfield stood near the control panel with 2 of his engineers, arms crossed, watching everything with careful attention. Gordon paced nearby, checking his watch every few minutes, as though the movement of the hands might somehow slow down on its own. Ryan arrived early, dressed in his usual work clothes, carrying his tool bag and a folder containing every piece of documentation he had gathered. Sam walked beside him, having insisted on coming, despite having no official role in the process. "You ready for this?" Sam asked quietly. "No," Ryan admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." Frank was already waiting near the engine, having arranged for the replacement cooling intake components Ryan would need, sourced quietly from a supplier who specialized in matching original manufacturer specifications exactly. It had taken several tense phone calls late into the night to secure a part that could be delivered before morning, and Frank had personally driven out to collect it himself. "Everything's here," Frank said, gesturing toward a sealed crate resting near the access panel. Exact match to the original specifications, not the substitute part that caused this mess in the first place. Whitfield stepped forward, addressing the small crowd with practiced authority. "To be clear, this test will proceed under strict supervision. Mr. Cole will replace the identified component and demonstrate his theory under controlled conditions. If the engine fails to respond appropriately, or if any safety concern arises, this test will be terminated immediately, and the original recommendation will stand." Ryan nodded, understanding perfectly well what remained unspoken beneath those careful words. One mistake, and everything he had worked toward these past several days would collapse instantly, taking his career along with it. He knelt beside the access panel and began the careful process of removing the damaged cooling intake component, working with the same steady precision that had guided him through hundreds of repairs over the years, though none of those repairs had ever carried stakes quite like this one. The old part came free after several tense minutes of careful maneuvering, revealing exactly the kind of degraded coating residue that had shown up in Lauren's lab report. A few of the engineers exchanged glances, clearly surprised by what they were seeing firsthand. "That residue pattern is consistent with thermal coating breakdown," one of Whitfield's engineers murmured, almost to herself. Whitfield said nothing, though his expression had grown noticeably more focused. Ryan carefully cleaned the surrounding housing, removing every trace of the degraded material before preparing to install the new component. His hands moved with practiced confidence, though sweat had begun forming along his brow despite the cool morning air inside the bay. Just as he began fitting the replacement part into position, a sudden crack of thunder rolled outside, followed almost immediately by the overhead lights flickering once, then steadying again. A summer storm had been building all morning, and now it announced itself with a sharp burst of wind against the building's metal roof. "Backup power is engaged," someone called out from the control room. "We're stable, but I'd move quickly if I were you." Ryan's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay focused, working methodically despite the mounting pressure. He secured the new component into place, double-checking every connection against his notes, refusing to let urgency rush him into a careless mistake. "Component installed," Ryan announced, stepping back slightly. Ready for initial power sequence. Whitfield exchanged a glance with Gordon, who nodded with visible tension. Proceed with a low-level test sequence, Whitfield instructed the control room. Minimal load. We monitor everything closely. The engine began its startup sequence. A low mechanical hum, building steadily, as systems activated one by one. Ryan stood beside the housing, watching the temperature gauge with an intensity that blocked out everything else happening around him. Sam stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly, clearly holding his breath. For the first several seconds, everything appeared normal. Then, without warning, the temperature gauge spiked sharply, far faster than expected. "We've got a surge," one of the engineers called out. "Intake temperature climbing fast." Gordon's face went pale. "Shut it down. Shut it down now." "Wait," Ryan said quickly, stepping closer to the gauge, studying the pattern of the spike rather than simply reacting to its presence. This matches what happened before the coating started breaking down originally. A brief pressure adjustment as the system recalibrates to the new component's slightly different flow rate. Give it another few seconds before shutting down completely. Whitfield studied the readings intently, his jaw tight with visible tension. "You're certain?" "I'm not certain," Ryan admitted honestly. "But shutting down now, right in the middle of the exact adjustment period I predicted, won't tell us anything either way." The room fell into a tense silence as everyone watched the gauge climb higher, dangerously close to the threshold that would trigger an automatic shutdown. Ryan's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat, every instinct screaming at him to second-guess himself, to admit he might be wrong before it was too late. Then, just as suddenly as it had spiked, the temperature reading leveled off, then began a slow, steady decline back toward normal operating range. A collective breath seemed to release throughout the room. "Temperature stabilizing," the control room technician announced, a note of disbelief clear in her voice. "We're back within normal parameters." Whitfield stepped closer to the gauge himself, studying the readings with an expression that had shifted from cautious skepticism to something closer to genuine surprise. "Increase to standard operational load," he instructed, though his voice carried less certainty than it had all week. The engine's hum deepened as the load increased, systems throughout the housing activating in a carefully orchestrated sequence. Ryan watched every gauge with unwavering focus, tracking temperature, pressure, and airflow simultaneously, cross-referencing each reading against the notes he had gathered over the past several days. Minutes passed like hours. The storm outside continued rattling against the building, thunder rolling in the distance, though inside the turbine bay, all attention remained fixed entirely on the engine's steady, increasingly confident hum. "Full operational load reached," the control room technician finally announced, all systems reporting normal parameters across the board. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the deep, steady rhythm of the engine running exactly as it should, exactly as it had before the failure that had thrown the entire plant into chaos just days earlier. Sam let out a laugh that sounded somewhere between relief and disbelief. "You actually did it." Whitfield stood motionless, staring at the readings on the control panel. His expression caught somewhere between professional disbelief and something that looked remarkably like genuine respect. "This isn't possible," he murmured, though his tone carried none of the dismissiveness from their first meeting. A coating breakdown this subtle should have required far more extensive diagnostic equipment to properly identify. "Sometimes it just takes someone who spends enough time watching the small details," Frank said, stepping up beside Ryan with a proud smile he made no attempt to hide. "Details that don't always show up on a checklist." Gordon approached slowly, his expression shifting through several emotions at once: relief, disbelief, and something that looked uncomfortably close to embarrassment. "Cole, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." "You don't owe me anything," Ryan said quietly. "I just didn't want to see people lose their jobs over a mistake that didn't have to happen." Whitfield extended his hand toward Ryan, his expression now entirely different from the dismissive tone he had carried throughout their earlier encounters. "I've spent over 20 years in this field and I've never seen a diagnostic conclusion overturned this way, by someone working entirely outside the traditional process. I owe you a proper conversation about how you identified this." Ryan shook his hand, still processing the weight of what had just happened. Only minutes earlier, he had been prepared to watch his entire theory collapse under the pressure of a single failed test. Now, the engine responsible for powering an entire city hummed steadily beside him, fully repaired for a fraction of the cost anyone had believed possible. Outside, the storm began to ease, sunlight breaking weakly through the clouds as the worst of the weather passed. Inside the turbine bay, an entirely different kind of storm had just been resolved, one that had threatened jobs, finances, and reputations, now settled by careful observation, stubborn persistence, and a willingness to look closely at details everyone else had been too rushed to notice. The signing scheduled for that morning was quietly canceled. Word spread through the plant almost instantly, technicians and staff members gathering near the turbine bay entrance, drawn by disbelief and curiosity in equal measure. Whispers filled the hallway, all carrying some version of the same astonished question. Had the maintenance technician everyone dismissed just saved the plant $5 million? Ryan stood quietly amid the growing crowd, exhausted but steady, watching the engine run smoothly for the first time in days. He thought about Ellie, still at school, unaware of everything that had just unfolded. He thought about the countless nights spent studying old manuals, chasing a theory nobody else believed in, refusing to give up even when every authority in the room had already decided the answer. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Ryan allowed himself a small, genuine smile. The engine was fixed, but more than that, something else had shifted today, something that went far beyond gauges and readings and technical reports. A quiet man who had spent years being overlooked had just proven, in the most undeniable way possible, that expertise sometimes lives in places nobody thinks to look. News of what happened at Blackstone Power Station spread quickly, first through the plant itself, then through the wider company network, and eventually to local news outlets curious about how a major power failure had been resolved without the massive replacement cost everyone had expected. Reporters began calling the front office, asking to speak with the technician responsible for the unlikely repair. Gordon, still visibly humbled by everything that had unfolded, personally recommended Ryan for a company-wide recognition award, something Blackstone had never given to a maintenance technician in its entire history. The award ceremony took place 2 weeks later, in the same conference room where Ryan had once been quietly dismissed in front of dozens of colleagues. This time, the room looked entirely different. Every seat was filled, and there was no laughter aimed in his direction, only quiet respect and genuine curiosity about how he had managed to see what an entire team of certified engineers had missed. Gordon stood at the front of the room, addressing the gathered staff with none of the nervous energy he had carried during the crisis itself. 3 weeks ago, this plant faced a decision that could have cost us $5 million and put dozens of jobs at risk. Today, thanks to the persistence and careful attention of one member of our maintenance team, this engine is running exactly as it should, and every single job on that reduction list has been safely removed. A round of applause filled the room, warm and genuine. Nothing like the polite formality Ryan had grown used to during company meetings. He stood near the back, uncomfortable with the sudden attention, though a small part of him allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Whitfield approached the podium next, surprising everyone in the room, including Ryan himself. "I want to be honest with everyone here," Whitfield said. "When Mr. Cole first raised his concerns about this failure, I dismissed them without giving them proper consideration. I trusted our standard diagnostic process completely, and I assumed that process was thorough enough to catch anything significant. I was wrong." He turned toward Ryan directly. "What you demonstrated wasn't luck. It was patience, careful observation, and a willingness to keep asking questions long after everyone else had stopped. That's a rare quality, and one I intend to make better use of going forward." Whitfield then announced something that caught Ryan completely off guard. The manufacturer had decided to create a new position within their broader engineering consultation network, specifically designed for experienced technicians whose hands-on knowledge could complement traditional diagnostic teams during complex failures. Whitfield personally recommended Ryan as the first person to fill that role, offering him a significant increase in salary, along with the opportunity to travel to other plants facing similar challenges. Ryan stood in stunned silence for a long moment, processing everything Whitfield had just said. Only weeks earlier, He had been quietly dismissed as an unqualified voice in a room full of experts. Now he was being offered a position that would put his instincts and experience to work across an entire network of facilities. "I don't know what to say," Ryan admitted, his voice slightly unsteady. "Say yes," Sam called out from the crowd, drawing a wave of laughter that finally broke the tension filling the room. Ryan accepted the position, and in the weeks that followed, his life began changing in ways he could barely have imagined during those long, exhausting nights spent studying old manuals at his kitchen table. The salary increase meant Ellie's medical expenses were no longer a constant source of quiet worry, and for the first time in years, Ryan found himself building a small savings account instead of simply surviving paycheck to paycheck. He used part of his first bonus to take Ellie on a trip they had talked about for years but never been able to afford, a few days near the coast, away from work schedules and maintenance logs and everything that had consumed his attention for so long. Sitting together on the beach one afternoon, watching Ellie build an elaborate sandcastle with far more architectural ambition than structural stability, Ryan felt a kind of peace he hadn't experienced in a very long time. "Are you still gonna fix things?" Ellie asked, patting a lopsided tower into place. "Different things now," Ryan said. "Bigger things. But yeah, I'll still be fixing things." "Good," she said simply, returning her full attention to her sandcastle, as though the matter had never really been in question. Back at Blackstone, Ryan's story became something of a quiet legend among the staff, a reminder that expertise didn't always arrive wearing a certain title or carrying a particular degree. Frank retired a few months later, proud to have played a small but meaningful part in helping Ryan gather the evidence that changed everything. Before he left, he pulled Ryan aside one final time. "You know," Frank said, "in almost 30 years working in this industry, I've seen plenty of smart people walk through these doors. But smart isn't always the same as right. You were right, and more importantly, you were patient enough to prove it instead of just being loud about it." "I almost didn't," Ryan admitted. "There were a dozen moments where it would have been easier to just let it go." "Most people do let it go," Frank said. "That's exactly why this story is worth telling." Whitfield, true to his word, began incorporating experienced technicians directly into his diagnostic process at other facilities, crediting Ryan's example as the reason for the change. Several months later, he personally recommended Ryan for an industry recognition, one that honored significant contributions to engineering safety and innovation, an honor typically reserved for credentialed professionals rather than maintenance technicians who had built their expertise through years of hands-on persistence rather than formal study. Ryan accepted the recognition with the same quiet humility he had carried throughout the entire ordeal, more focused on what the achievement meant for Ellie's future than on any personal sense of validation. Still standing on that stage, looking out at a room full of engineers and industry professionals who had once represented everything he felt excluded from, he allowed himself a private moment of quiet satisfaction. Sam remained his closest friend throughout everything, occasionally joking that he deserved partial credit simply for encouraging Ryan not to give up during those difficult early days. Ryan never disagreed. Some of the most important moments in his journey hadn't come from grand technical breakthroughs, but from small, steady encouragement offered exactly when he needed it most. Years later, when new technicians joined Blackstone Power Station, they often heard some version of Ryan's story during their initial training, a reminder that careful observation and stubborn persistence sometimes mattered more than any framed certificate hanging on an office wall. Ryan himself made a point of mentoring several of these newer employees personally, encouraging them to trust their instincts while still respecting the value of careful evidence and thorough documentation. One evening, long after the crisis had faded into a distant, almost unbelievable memory, Ryan sat on his porch watching Ellie ride her bicycle along their quiet street, her laughter carrying easily through the warm evening air. He thought about how close everything had come to falling apart, how easily an entire plant, hundreds of jobs, and his own family's stability could have been lost to a decision made too quickly, based on assumptions nobody had bothered to question. He thought about every quiet night spent studying, every moment of doubt he had pushed through, and every small piece of encouragement that had kept him moving forward when giving up would have been so much easier. Ellie rode past him, waving cheerfully before circling back toward the driveway. Ryan smiled, watching her with a quiet sense of gratitude that had nothing to do with awards, recognition, or salary increases, and everything to do with the simple fact that he had never stopped trying, even when everyone around him had already decided the outcome. Sometimes, he had learned, the biggest problems weren't solved by the loudest voice in the room or the most impressive title on a business card. Sometimes, they were solved by someone patient enough to keep looking, long after everyone else had already given up. And sometimes, that quiet persistence changed everything.